All right, good morning or afternoon, depending upon what you think 12 o'clock is. But I want to welcome everybody back to our brown bag session. Before we get started, I do want to thank Daniel Smith over in e-learning for helping us with our link. We evidently were having trouble with our link getting out and being able to be accessible. They still don't know what I did, but at least we were able to fix it. So I thank them for that. Today we are lucky enough to have Dr. Denise Lovett, who is relatively new to our campus, and so I'm glad that you all will get a chance to meet her if you haven't already. She is coordinator of the Africana Studies here on campus. She has a bachelor's and a master's from Florida A&M with a PhD in psychology from the University of Cincinnati. And since we're doing diversity and inclusion, we've brought her in to talk about her specialty. At this point, please keep your mics muted. If you have a question, ask it in the chat and we'll get to it later. When you do ask a question later, please turn on your camera if you have one so that we're doing a face-to-face and not this strange head in a box thing. Um, but other than that, I'm going to turn over the floor. I thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for being here. So it's all you now.
Thank you, Dr. Laverne, and thank you, Mr. Moats, for moderating this. So, one of the first questions that I tend to ask students regarding research is, what's the first thing you think about when you think about research? And they talk about being intimidated by the process. They talk about, I don't understand why it's important, why do we have to do all this reading, that sort of thing. By the end of a lot of my classes, students start to figure out that the opinions and the decisions that they make are going to be based in some type of research finding that's been found that they might not even be aware of. And so what I tend to do is I'll invite research teams. I'll ask students, who's interested in doing research with me, or else I will have classes where I focus on having the student complete a research proposal by the end of that particular class. There's some special classes that I might have like that, like a research methods class, or a seminar class like we're doing this semester. In the past, when I've invited students to join research teams, when I've invited students to work on class projects, which would result in really good research, I also tell them that it's a good idea to come up with a research strategy that is going to benefit the communities from which they come. And so a lot of times my focus is usually on not what's wrong with the community that you've come from, but what are the strengths in that community and how do you want to capitalize on those strengths in that community. And so I've had some really good research with students over the past many years where I have taken students to research conferences which might focus on Africana populations, or students might go ahead and present research that might be at a university-wide level as kind of like a test case, if you will, before they go out into the real world and present their research to audiences that might not necessarily be as friendly as the university campus would be. A lot of people don't necessarily know that part of the reason that we have IRB protections or an institutional review board is in the first place is because of the Tuskegee experiments. And basically what happened in terms of the Tuskegee experiments is that we had the National Health Service, affiliated with the U.S. government, which basically allowed syphilis to go on in a group of African American men in Tuskegee, Alabama. And this research, if you will, occurred over a 40-year period from the 1930s to early 1970 when that particular study was exposed for basically allowing African American men to die and to suffer grave consequences as a result of syphilis, when the U.S. government already knew that the cure for syphilis already existed, but they let the research go on for years and years and years. And there was a House panel, there were congressional hearings, and after the congressional hearings, that's when we came up with an institutional review board where universities and other organizations that conduct research have to have IRB protections in place to make sure that any participant in a study could be protected against any malfeasance that might occur on the part of the people collecting research. Another thing that I tend to tell students is we need to look at whose research is promoted, because a lot of the research that's promoted isn't necessarily research by diverse populations at all. And a lot of journals, excuse me, especially for psychology being as traditional as it is, they don't tend to be as open to diverse perspectives, and that's part of the reason that we see some of the same type of research over and over and over again. And so I think it's very important in my classes to ensure that students are exposed to research that is going to benefit the community, but that's also going to tell a different story, as opposed to coming at research or coming at the participants in a study from a deficit model. I always ask the students to consider another way of viewing their research participants. Are there any questions so far or comments? None? Okay. So I'm going to ask the audience then, what's the first thing that you all think about when you think about research?
I can throw something out there for you.
Yes.
For the first thing that I usually think about with research, because I come from the history field. Research to me is usually like archives, looking for like primary documents, secondary sources from other like researchers or historians. Um, so that's what I usually connect research to, is just from my background as a history student. I look towards research as like primary and secondary sources, finding those and balancing those.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else?
Another
Yes.
historian.
Okay.
When I think about research, I focus a lot on the types of sources that people use or that we use. Reliable sources, authored sources, usually sources that are reviewed, um, which I think, especially with current events, there's this emphasis on doing your own research, and there's a concern about what are your sources when you do research. So to me, when I think about research, a big part of it is vetting sources and making sure that they're sources.
Okay. Thank you. I have some historians out here. Okay.
I'll say that my answer is a little bit different, I guess. Uh, the first thing that popped in my head was a lot of really dark libraries with books, and spending a great deal of time with all the dust and finding things that other people had missed or forgotten.
Yeah, I like what you all said there in terms of some things that might have been missed. Because like I said, there's this research narrative that we have in terms of what's considered good research, but a lot of times science is not objective. We want to say that science is objective, but science is not objective. Science is subjective. And so the worldview of the person who's going to be doing the research is going to inform the way that what they might study. is going to inform the way that they interpret their findings, because I found in some of the psychology research that the researcher might say that this particular thing was a finding of the research, but they're coming at it from a deficit-based model where there's something inherently wrong with the participants in the research study in the first place. But then when I read the research, then I'm seeing something different. I might go ahead and actually read that correlation table to see how can we put this in a way where it's going to benefit the community that was under study in the first place. And in a lot of ways, there have been universities and different institutions that have done really bad research with Africana populations, basically encourage the narrative that there are all these things and there are all these traumas that Africana populations have in the first place. And because there are all of these negative things ascribed to it, then there's like nothing good that's going to even come out of this in the first place. And so that's part of the reason that I do encourage my students to undertake the research enterprise in the first place, so that they can see, okay, you have a particular community, but what are the strengths of that community? And if you can see what the strengths of that community are, then you can capitalize on those strengths and you can come up with research, with good, sound research that's going to benefit the community in the long run. Any comments, questions about that?
Sarah
So
Fitzgerald says she loves it.
yes, yes. So one of the things that I really like about research, I'm going to tell you all a little bit about the way that I got into research and became a research nerd in the first place. When I was working on my master's degree, then we were told that the easiest way to go into research in terms of completing the thesis that we had to do was to ask different faculty members, what type of research are you working on? And then from there, get with the faculty member who's working on some research that you might be interested in. And so I ended up doing that with the former chair of the psych department. We were basically asking which HBCU psychology departments offer courses in Black psychology or any type of multicultural psychology or anything along those lines. Because at that time, we found this out because a lot of the research, I need to go back, a lot of the research that's in the textbooks right now, a lot of that research in terms of the psychological perspective, a lot of that research does not involve communities of color at all. The average participant in a psychology experiment is a white male college sophomore. And then we extrapolate those findings to the entire population. And so there's not a lot of pushback on that, and then hence the need for more researchers of color to push back against some of these findings that come out in the psychology literature. So back in 1933, I think it was 1933, a guy named Herman Kennedy, he was a psychologist, a Black psychologist back then, and he basically did an analysis. He sent out surveys to the HBCUs that offered psychology, and he wanted to see whether or not at that time, 1933, they had something along the lines of what they called race psychology. And here it was, I think it was like 50, maybe about 50 years later, I think, a little bit over 50 years later, might be 55, 60. Then my former chair, he decided to replicate that particular study. And so I'm replicating that study. I had to look over what Dr. Kennedy did, or what Mr. Kennedy did. And I sent out I sent out another survey just basically asking those sorts of questions, asking what type of courses were offered in the curriculum and whatnot. And we found that here it was 50, 60 years later, and only a third of HBCUs at that time had offered a Black psychology course. And for it to be an HBCU or historically Black college or university, we were like, well, there's still a lot of work to be done, because we can come out of the 60s and 70s and still only have a third of HBCUs even offer a Black psychology course. And even for Valdosta State University, in looking at our psychology curriculum, we don't have any type of cultural related psychology course. And psychology is the study of people, and the study of people has to involve culture. And so, but we don't have that right now. And so this semester I'm teaching a Black psychology course, and in teaching the Black psychology course, then the students are being exposed to research by Black psychologists about Black populations. And in being exposed to that research, you're like, how come this isn't in my intro textbook? Well, there's a certain perspective that we're going for in an intro textbook. We're going for racelessness in an intro textbook. And that is problematic in and of itself, because Dr. Eduardo Bonilla Silva has written a book called Racism Without Racists. And that book is in I think it's like the 5th or 6th edition. And he's, constantly updated that particular book. But in that book, he talks about how being colorblind basically means that there are going to be some communities of color that are going to be overlooked in terms of best practices, in terms of the psychology research, even in terms of a lot of the historical research. Then that's a possibility too. Because something else that I also bring to students is I ask them, do you think that during slavery there were, some people who might have, revolted against slavery or against the system? And they don't really think about how that might have been a possibility. But when I tell them there were thousands of slave revolts, I didn't even know about that until within the past 10 years, because a guy named Herbert Aptheker, for my historians, a guy named Herbert Aptheker, he wrote a book back in the 60s about the thousands of slave revolts that existed. And so when students find that there were revolts against slavery, then it gives them a different perspective, and it's a different way of even themselves having that legacy of slavery. It's a different way of even looking at themselves, and it encourages them to think outside of what they've been told all their lives. And so that's some of the other research that I'm bringing into the classroom as well. The finding that, for instance, we talked about this in my Africana Studies seminar class. We talked about how a lot of research is starting to show that when Black students have a sense of who they are, they do better in school. They rise to the occasion in terms of being told like how far they can go. And I even offer the story, or the stories that I have, of working with former students in the past who didn't necessarily have the best GPA, didn't necessarily come from, what some might consider the best schools. But by the time they get to my classroom and I'm telling them that we're going to do research, we're going to do this research study, and we're going to present it at this national conference and all of that, they're scared, but along the same lines, they're like, I think I can do it because Dr. Lovett believes I can do it, but I also know this about myself now, so this is what I'm going to do. And so I just enjoy having those types of experiences with the students, and bringing in research and the importance of research and how it can really transform lives. Any questions, comments?
I really like your position on bringing in new information and teaching students what's not in our textbooks, because, as you know, I have a course on African to African American philosophy and religious studies. And they're always shocked when I hand them this one article that talks about all the philosophers that you hear about, Hume, Descartes, all these, Kant, all the rest of them, who were just incredibly racist. And yet we teach them as though they're the best philosophers that could ever be. And so it's always a little shocking, and they're always a little upset because they feel that they've been taken advantage of because they never knew this, because these philosophers are supposed to be such great people. And it's not to say that they might not have been good people in their own traits, but it's interesting what we miss if we don't dig harder. So I appreciate
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. Yes, yes, absolutely. And I was a history minor, and it's amazing to me. I was a history minor as an undergrad, and part of the reason I was a history minor was because I was just always fascinated with history and whatnot. And then the way that my parents raised us was like we knew about our history, and that's part of the way that my parents racially socialized us. But it was interesting because we always had these. Okay, so back in this. Okay, I'm dating myself now. Okay, but back in the 70s, Budweiser used to put out these posters, Great Kings and Queens of Africa. And I used to have those posters like in my room. And my dad recently gave me like a couple of boxes of some of the historical documents that he had kept, and in that box was a big gigantic poster of the great kings and queens of Africa that Budweiser had put out, like in the 70s. And I thought it was really interesting because when you teach students that they have a history that came before slavery, then you also get a different type of student who's like, oh, I can do this, that type of thing. And so it instills a kind of confidence in them that is just being shown in a lot of the psychological research and even in a lot of the educational literature that's out there. Did you have a question?
I do. So I'm curious if you've seen the effects of helping students understand the value of research and helping students see psychology beyond just through this white lens, and understanding, the need to expand psychological approaches. Have you seen any evidence of students being more open to or changing attitudes towards practical psychology, like actually going and receiving counseling or therapy, and working with a psychologist for their mental health?
That's part of. It's funny you should mention that, Dr. Fitzgerald, because I've been working on a grant with one of our community leaders, and one of the things that we're talking about is bringing in a psychologist or a licensed professional counselor in terms of providing therapy. But I offered this caveat as well. So when I'll go back. Okay, so I claim Houston as home. And during Hurricane Katrina, when Houston had this whole, influx of people from New Orleans coming in, it was so funny. This part was funny. We went to, at that time, I was president-elect for the Association of Black Psychologists in Houston. And so we went to the convention center to see, how we could help and whatnot in terms of, either providing counseling or, connecting the evacuees to resources. When we walked in there, then there was a big, gigantic sign that said mental health. Of course, no one was over there because if psychologists are trained in terms of knowing something about other cultures, then they would know that Black people are not going to go seek counseling when there's a big gigantic sign that says mental health. That's just not going to happen. And so they were, so the people who were over there at that time, they were, they were sitting over there idle. Of course, no one was over there. And so we went over there to, get checked in and whatnot. Some of the clinical psychologists who were, among in our group, then they basically, showed their credentials and whatnot. And after that, we went into the floor where everyone was, and we were just basically talking to people one-on-one, just basically asking, how can we help? What do you need? That type of thing. And at that point, then they talked about, okay, I need to know who does hair. I need to know who keeps kids. I need help finding my uncle, or something along those lines. And we were helping in that way, because that opens the door to later on when they're starting to experience some type of distress or anxiety, then they will reach out to those same psychologists who they had seen earlier, who basically offer their services. And so hence the need for cultural competency. But it's so important for psychologists to have a degree of cultural competence where they would know better than to put up a big gigantic sign saying mental health.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that was really interesting. And so what I'm finding too is that in writing in helping to write this particular grant with one of the community leaders here in Valdosta, what always comes out in the literature too is that if you have if you have a Black person who needs psychological help, then they're not going to necessarily just go to just anybody. They're more concerned about going to someone who they believe understands their perspective and understands where they're coming from. And so I think to a great degree, there's still too many people in the therapeutic setting that do not understand that point at all. And so I'm always concerned about mental health practitioners who might possibly do more harm than good in terms of working with populations of color.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also tell students that it's okay if you're working with a therapist, but you feel like that particular therapist doesn't understand you and you quit that therapist. It's okay. Like the same way that we might go see a doctor who treats us better than other doctors, then we should have that same sort of standard in terms of our mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
So yeah, after I did that, after my former chair and I, did that particular study regarding the Black psychology in HBCUs, when I moved on to my PhD program, I ran into someone someone I consider to be a mentor to this day, Dr. Kathy Burlew. And when I was looking at PhD programs, I'm thinking, okay, I want to apply to a PhD program where I can do research with Black populations, because that's what I'm used to doing. And so she was like, well, if you should apply to our school, because that's what we do. And then I had someone else in my other ear saying, well, you should apply to our school, because I said do that, but you'll get an opportunity to do X, Y, Z. And so I was kind of cracking up about that whole thing, but it ended up being a really good fit, because I got a chance to, when I did go to University of Cincinnati, I got a chance to know other psychologists of color and the type of research they were doing. And I also got a chance to work with a research program. There was an intervention program that was being run in the community among kids in grade 6. And I got a chance to work with that particular program, and I really enjoyed that. And so that's where I could really see the benefits of research and how research would benefit the community and basically add to the research that's out there in the first place. Comments or questions about that?
I have a slightly different question. I know when we research in indigenous populations all over the world, we have different methodologies that we use that are specific to indigenous cultures. Are there methodologies that are different for Africana studies? Because right now I'm having a hard time, and we as a group have a hard time getting academia to recognize these differing methodologies. And I was wondering if you had any of those experiences.
Well, I know one thing is that, okay, so what you mean by methodologies? Are you talking about like whether it's a qualitative or quantitative type of studies in terms of interviews or focus
Yeah,
groups or something like
to, yeah, to a certain extent. But one, indigenous studies really don't put any stock in the quantitative studies. But the qualitative, even down to the methodologies of how they're done. So ethnography became very big in sociology, and they could never understand why indigenous cultures didn't approve of the ethnographic sort of methodology that was being done. Um, but so we have specific guidelines for how to research in indigenous cultures that are still not recognized. It's still an
that?
outside in kind of thing.
Oh, that's interesting. What? Okay, so there's been some pushback. It's been really interesting. Um, Basically, research that's done with Black populations, we can get richer data using a qualitative perspective. That just goes without saying. And so what we found is that the focus group interviews or the one-on-one interview or a case study or something along those lines, that's given us richer data, but along the same lines, within psychological science, there's a lot of emphasis on the quantitative methodology. And with the quantitative, you just fill out the survey, let's crunch the numbers, and then we're done. And so they don't, unfortunately, because there's not value placed on anything that's not quantitative, in I'm saying, I want to say in the social sciences in general, but especially in the field of psychology, then that research that might take place with Black populations would basically be marginalized because it's not necessarily including, the crunching of the numbers and the SPSS and whatnot. So I do want to say that there is a problem and there is a premium placed on the quantitative research over the qualitative research in the field of psychology. And in doing that, then it basically marginalizes the Africana populations or the other populations of color that could be studied.
Do you think that's, I don't want to say exactly intentional, but is it a systemic issue? Is there a way for psychology or social sciences to get beyond that you can think of?
Yeah, I think it boils down again to worldview because in the social sciences, then everything can be measured. And if it can't be measured, then it doesn't exist, right? But it's kind of hard to measure spirituality, right? And it's kind of hard to measure like how people feel as a result of, I just meditated this morning and I feel good now, and now I'm ready to face the world. It's kind of hard to measure those things that are, I want to say squishy. It's kind of hard to measure those things that are not as empirical, um, tangible, considered objective, but they're not really objective. It's kind of hard to measure those types of things. So I
I
think
get
that's part of the reason that there's a premium placed on that.
Yeah, I agree. It's a totally different idea of research when you do what we in Indigenous studies and African studies call taking spirit seriously, as opposed to eliminating it. And it does bring an entirely different focus to the research. And I'm wondering if you find those introductory textbooks that eliminate this actually can do more harm in teaching our students, all students of all races and ethnicities, um, if that's something that you think we could outgrow.
Can it be outgrown? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah,
Okay. And it's hard to say because I'll give you another example. Like I taught I've taught intro in the past, and I had the opportunity to help to write an intro psychology textbook that is completely free with open stacks, and we were trying to make sure that we're bringing in like the cultural perspective to different parts of the chapter. Um, but it's hard to get some psychology departments across the country to recognize the value of a free textbook for students in which they can see themselves in the textbook. It's- because it's supposed to be about life. That's what it's supposed to be about, but it's not necessarily speaking to the real life experiences of students. And that's part of the reason that I always supplement in my classes with what on one hand we have, what's in the textbook. But on the other hand, there's some pieces missing from the textbook. For example, I teach a history of psychology course this semester. And like I said, with me being a history minor when I was an undergrad, I just really enjoyed history. I always love that stuff. So with the history of psychology textbook, then there's not a lot in terms of diversity at all. But along the same lines, there's a lot that I'm bringing in terms of, I think students should know who the first Black psychologist was. I think students should know that the term psychology comes from Saku, which comes from Kemet, which is another word for Egypt. I think they should know who the first Black woman psychologist was. So one thing that I have brought in is, say for instance, we might be talking about we might be talking about the history of intelligence testing, for example. And we go through all of this from Binet to Terman to the Stanford Binet and whatnot. And along the same lines, they find out from me that we use that same type of intelligence testing to sterilize mostly women across this country with the eugenics movement. But along with that, I always ask the question, were there any other psychologists out there who pushed back against that intelligence testing? And they don't know of any other psychologists out there in terms of pushing back against that intelligence testing because those psychologists are not in the textbook. But the person who is in the textbook, the people who should be in the textbook in terms of what did the Black community say about this testing? What did the Hispanic community say about this testing? And so in my history of psychology class, they learn about George Sanchez and how he pushed back against the way that this testing was being used. They learn about Horace Mann Bond, who was the father, he was either father or grandfather of Julian Bond, who was himself an educator. And so Horace Mann Bond, with him pushing back against the way that those results were being used, then the students learn another way. They learn another way that existed that's not in the textbook, but they also learn that everything that has happened in the textbooks that they have, everything that has happened regarding all of the research out there, there has always been pushback. And they learn who the people are who are pushing back.
I like that. Anita Davis has a question. Anita?
Okay.
I'm trying to get my sound back here, sorry.
Okay.
So I have a tendency to blame Plato for everything that happens to us that's wrong. So, um, looking at ourselves in sort of a universal way as we approach the science of humanity, or and the way we as Western civilization approach the way we do science is really what the problem is here, is that it's been led by people without perspectives that are healthy for our communities. We are just simply biased in the way we do science. So bringing that to this is wonderful how you're talking about this and the specifics of what should be in the curriculum for students and faculty researchers to understand. So, and in my case, it's a lot of what goes on in schooling and teaching and learning, which also connects to the university. And so, um, what is the way looking forward? Because we tend to look backwards, like what happened at Tuskegee was just horrible, and out of that came IRBs, and of course we have, as you said, and so on in the ways that you're, trying to get our students to understand. But is there something in the practice of our human sciences that we can sort of start from zero and avoid Plato and all of the things that have followed since in Western society? That's kind of an odd question, but I tend to think big. Sorry.
So you're asking about what type of practice could instructors, professors use in terms of ensuring that we're not making the same mistakes of the past?
That's it. That's it.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Like
Okay.
starting at this point, let's try a clean slate for my research.
Mhm.
And I do a lot of qualitative stuff because that's the world of questions. And so unfortunately here I don't have a program that's research based, but I have the students engaged in research in ways. So what would be sort of a clean slate that we could use here to just start or reframe our investigations?
Mhm. Mhm. I would say that I think one of the first things I would do is to ask students to type in whatever their field is, because you're dealing with educators, right?
Yes, I deal with educators, and of course, there's a lot embedded in history there too. So,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What I would do is, what I tend to do is this. I would ask students to think about what's important to them. And whatever that topic is that's important to them, I would have them type that particular topic into like one of the databases, that we have here on campus. We have a number of different databases. We have at least 3 psychology databases, a couple of sociology databases and whatnot. I would ask them to type in a topic that's important to them. And I would ask them to not only are they typing in a topic that's important to them, but I would say, like, say for instance, they're interested in self-efficacy. Or say for instance, they're interested in like academic achievement or something like that. I would have them type in academic achievement and Black or African American or something along those lines and see what comes up in the literature. And once they look at the type of articles that come up as a result, then from there, they would get a different perspective, because then they would be able to find that research that's already out there, that's not necessarily in the textbook, but along the same lines, that's research that may speak more to where they would like to go and ways that they would like to benefit their communities. And then another thing that I asked them to do too is this: if they could look at that research and look at the reference pages of the whatever research article it is that they're interested in, then they could look at some of that research, because then that gives them the historical piece, but it also gives them some of the theoretical pieces and some of the underlying assumptions that already exist and that might have driven that research in the first place. So does that make sense?
Yes, and if I could just ask a further question quickly, and then I won't take up any more time. So what I'm hearing, because most of what I do is our students are applying their understanding in the teaching field. And they're the new teachers that we hope will bring education forward in the future. So what I'm hearing is that my students need in all of their classes leading up to our certification across campus is something where they should have an opportunity to start with what are their interests and searching information for each and every class that they have, so that that becomes part of practice. So anyway, it's just
Yeah.
a shame, we can't do that. So
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in that, because I think that all of the classes, I think that all of the classes that we're taking and that we're teaching, all of those have textbooks. Most of the classes have textbooks. Most of the textbooks are based in some sort of research. There has to be a way to supplement that research so that it enhances the student, because the research does show that when students are studying information that's specific to their experiences, that they do better in classes. And so
yeah,
if they could have that opportunity, even in terms of like maybe an assignment or something along those lines, then those opportunities exist where we would be able to do that. Bell Hooks wrote a book called Teaching to Transgress, excuse me. And I love that book. That is just such a good book, because in that book she talks about using Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. Because in doing that, not only are you teaching students that there's information out there that could benefit them in their communities, but it also teaches them to critically think about some of the information that they are receiving in the classroom. Because if they're critically thinking about some of the information that they're receiving in the classroom, then they can, as my sister told me at one point, she was a philosophy major, they could spit out the bones, if you will, and take like the meat,
yeah,
that does work for them and that does fit into their worldview.
cool. Thank you so much.
We have time for one last question. And Jamie Landau over in the chat has written, is Franz Fanon read and taught in Africana Studies? Just curious, since he was a French West Indian philosopher and psychiatrist who I've read and found really powerful.
Yes, yeah. And see, I would love to. Wow, Jamie, it's funny you should ask that question. So one of the classes that we're going to be offering over the summer is called Christianity and Colonialism in Africa. And one of the books that I want the students to read for that particular class would be a book by Frantz Fanon called Wretched of the Earth, because it would speak to that colonialism piece. Frantz Fanon was a very interesting character. I saw someone did a documentary about him a few years ago that I saw that I thought was really decent. But he basically wrote a book called Black Skin, White Mask. And in writing that book, he basically talked about the experience of Black people on the island of Martinique in terms of their complicated relationship with France. And he in his talking about it, then he was basically suggesting that for some Black people, they feel that they have to put on a white mask, if you will, to kind of blend in and whatnot. And so that's one of the first books that he's written. But by the time before he died, I think he had cancer. He had gone to Algeria and was one of the freedom fighters in Algeria after having worked at a psychiatric hospital in Algeria. And at the psychiatric hospital, he basically found that, and it basically challenged like his whole worldview, the medical training that he had in France. But he basically found that a lot of the men who were in the psychiatric hospital in the first place were there because they were seen as being mentally ill because they were going against colonialism. And so basically, and it's similar to some of the research work, if you will, that was done by John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who basically suggested that there was more mental illness among Black people in the North because they were free. So the Black people in the South who were enslaved, they weren't mentally ill because freedom basically caused Black people to become mentally ill. And so, so Frantz Fanon basically, you know, his whole world was just um, basically there was a big pivot when he did find that a lot of the men who were in the sanatorium were there because they were freedom fighters.
Her comment is that's the book that she read, and she wants to thank you for sharing more about this story and the journey of inquiry. She says too, I didn't know the update, so thank you, Jamie. We are at our time, and I want to thank everybody who came in. But I want to thank you for a wonderful hour and very informative. And people will be able to look at this on our website, and maybe we'll see a change in some of the academic offerings.
Yes, that would be wonderful. I'm busily proposing courses.
I like it. Well, with that, I want to thank you, and I hope you have a good day, the rest of your day. We appreciate you being
Thank you.
here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you asking me, Dr. Laverne. I
Well,
appreciate it.
it's always a pleasure, always fun.
Yes,
So I
yes,
want everybody to have a
definitely.
good day, and we will stop the recording.